Hello, Moonstone Hunters, and welcome to the Tales of Tauber. Tauber is the fantastical home of the wonderfully whimsical skirmish game Moonstone, brought to you by Goblin King Games. So grab yourself a tea cake and a mug of mead and listen to the next page from Tales of Tauber. The Peace of Machburg Hall.
Are we nearly there? I'm thirsty and my feet hurt.
Glib's companion huffed, stopped and leant on his staff as if the trek through the hallways was an arduous journey. Glib examined the ancient goblin by his side. Bent like a snake and leaning on a stick, his feet had incessantly shuffled across the slabs beside Glib. Now he had stopped, he was staring all around him open-mouthed, more so than when he was trundling at a glacial pace. Not that I can blame him for staring, Glib thought, as he also took a moment to appreciate this vast hall. Situated at the heart of Machburg's council buildings, the hall dripped with chandeliers, polished wood and gilt. All them columns and arches, Glib thought. All them posh words and maxims wrote on the walls. Industry begets progress. Do naught but in earnest. Tea cakes for all. All very clever, all very superficial. We're nearly there, Glib said, turning his attention back to the goblin. Now, do you know why we're here? What our mission is? What can you tell me?
Let me see.
The goblin frowned for a moment as he leant on his walking stick and counted the fingers on his free hand. He looked up at Glib and said, "No." So you have no idea why we've been sent here? Glib tried to keep the annoyance from his voice. How could he not know? Everybody and his dog had heard the rumors. Everybody expected Diana to sue for peace. Glib's boss had been very agitated when she told him. I thought you knew why we're here, the goblin shrugged. Glib sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. Why me? Why, out of all the Dominion delegates, has the boss sent me here to look after this relic? She could have ordered me to spy on someone important, like Diana, or Duchess Default, or even El Capitano. She could have ordered me to steal some precious artifact, or plans to a hidden fortress. But no, instead she orders me to protect this fossil. Why? What's so important about him? Name? A voice rumbled above Glib's head. Glib looked up and saw a sergeant-at-arms stood over him, big of height and long of limb. He was so slender, Glib wondered he didn't bend under the weight of his helmet. The extravagance of his colourful jacket, all padded sleeves and puffed shoulders, contrasted with the simplicity of his leggings. Crikey, they're tight, Glib thought as he looked away, startled. Name? The sergeant formed the words slowly and deliberately. Do you understand? Glib scowled. Just one punch to the knackers, and I'll wipe that look off your face." Glib said, "This is Fliggum Flaggum, I know. He used to be an adviser to the Queen Diana." The sergeant-at-arms nodded politely to Fliggum. Then he poked Glib in the chest with just enough force to push him backward. "I was actually enquiring after your name, gnome." "I'm Glib," he said through clenched teeth. "I bet you are." The sergeant turned his nose up and said, "And a stranger to soap and water by the smell of it."
"Please, may I sit down, young man?"
Fliggum said to the sergeant-at-arms.
"I'm old and my feet hurt."
"Oh, yes, right, you are." The sergeant stepped to one side and gestured toward a highly decorated bench in the shadows. "Please, make yourself comfortable." Fliggum made an appreciative sound, shuffled across, then settled onto the bench. He sighed with satisfaction. The sergeant turned his attention back to Glib. "Now, it's Tackle, isn't it?" Fliggum called from the bench. "Sergeant Tackle, yes."
"Here you are, Sergeant Tackle. Take this for your trouble."
The goblin waved a piece of paper at Tackle, who politely strode over. He took the blank, green and tatty paper with a frown. He gave it a cursory glance, then looked again, staring. Glib watched as a strange transformation crept across Tackle's face. His expression softened from a scowl into one of almost stupefied fascination. With a flat voice and eyes like saucers, the sergeant bowed and said, "Thank you, sir. Most generous."
"Use it wisely,"
Fliggum said as he stood, then shuffled towards the open doors to the chamber beyond. Glib frowned at Tackle. What was all that about? Tips come in coins, don't they? Usually in small denonet small amounts. How can anybody tip with a piece of blank paper? And what happened to Sergeant Tackle? Why did he suddenly appear so mesmerized and pliable?
"Don't dwaddle, Glib. We're already late,"
Fliggum shouted over his shoulder as he shuffled closer towards the hall. Glib caught up with Fliggum just as the goblin entered the hall. He took a deep breath to admonish the geriatric for wandering off, but the words died on Glib's lips as he stared at the opulence before him. High as the tallest steeple and half as wide, the hall's ceiling and walls were festooned in murals and tapestries depicting some of Tauber's greatest figures and most historic moments. The great moonstone bloom of 668, the birth of the Commonwealth, the invention of the tea cake, it was all here in glorious color. And so were the most important people in Tauber. in his tracks and stared at the gathering before him. Set in an amphitheatre of concentric benches, the great and the good of Tauber society gathered in enclaves, waiting for proceedings to commence. As Glib descended one of the 3 flights of steps that divided the amphitheatre into thirds, he was struck by just how great and good those delegates were. Fliggum was slowly climbing the steps among the third occupied by the Dominion's representatives. Among them lurked a cove of Tauber's most famous pirates. Set together, they leered and waved at the Commonwealth's wealthiest members. Glib's breath caught in his throat. How famous some of them is! El Capitano, Captain Longjohns, Lady Broadsides, some of me very favourites. "Sit, boy," Fliggum called as he pointed to a space next to him on one of the Dominion benches. Glib sat down, and Fliggum groaned as he lowered himself carefully onto the bench. The geriatric grimaced as he sat and squirmed. His piles must be bad again. Well, he can't whistle if he thinks I'm rubbing any ointments on him. Glib's attention turned towards the delegates from the Commonwealth. All the big wigs is there, he thought. Mama Gimble, Kaufmann and his towering bodyguard Brunhilde, Sir Gillibot Poppycock, Baron Fun Fancyhead. A small sneer stole across Glib's lips. Look at them, all pomp and circumstances, with their flash clothes and chains of office, all looking down on me 'cause I'm just a scruffy and unschooled gnome. Glib turned away from the prissy Commonwealth and stared at the final third of seating in the hall, which lay empty. The seats stretched back behind the council representatives who were talking quietly to each other. Glib knew that the Elrich would take those seats eventually. I wonder if one of them will tell me what I'm doing here. A human man, dressed in a brown velvet suit and a powder-white wig, stood from among the council. He strode to the centre of the amphitheatre and shouted, "I, the Speaker of this great council, do call this meeting to order." He grasped his lapels as he waited for the assembled delegates to stop talking. He'll be waiting a long time, thought Glib, as he listened to the stratum of chatter and gossip that flowed about the hall. Tea-cakes, moonstones, Duck the Flatulent, the Battle of Bone Refuge, so many topics, so little attention to or interest in the meeting and the speaker. Glib looked about the room with a bored sigh, and his gaze fell on Diana. Hovering above her seat on the front row, her wings oscillated as she and her retinue of fae regarded those around them with expressions that betrayed one part bemusement, one part superiority, and 2 parts disgust. Glib stared at her. His eyes lingered on her painted skin and lithe limbs. Glib tore his gaze away before she saw him staring and turned his attention to the small number of fawns set amongst the Commonwealth. They kept themselves to themselves, whispering to one another and glancing at both delegations. The leader, a male with magnificent horns, was already seated, seemingly disinterested in proceedings, he and one of Mama Gimble's entourage, young Jack, were engaged in a game involving small stones. Front and centre of the Commonwealth delegation sat the slender elegance that was Baron von Fancyhead. Seated opposite Diana, he twirled his moustache as he studied the Queen of the Fae. Whilst the humans caused a riot of colour in their fine silks and golden chains, the gnomes amongst the Commonwealth were both more modestly dressed and much shorter. Some made daring attempts to scale their bench and take their seats, whilst those who had already accomplished this epic climb strained on tiptoes to watch proceedings. Some of the gnomes glared at Glip, distrust in their eyes. Glip looked away, cheeks burning. "What are they staring at? They've no right to judge me. How do they knows how I cames to be here, cames to have no home and no mother, lost in the wildwood? Not my fault my boss is a wizard agent."
"Please,"
the speaker shouted again, his voice almost lost in the hubbub of the room.
"I pray silence so that we may commence."
"Be quiet!" Queen Diana shouted. Silence fell on the hall like a guillotine as Diana glared at the assembled delegates. "Speaker of the House," Diana said to the bewigged human, satisfied the assembled delegates were suitably quiet. "You may proceed."
"Thank you, Your Highness,"
the speaker said. He attempted a courteous bow, but his wig slipped. Grasping the errant rock, he straightened his back and shouted, "My lord and ladies, gentlemen and sailors, warriors and poets, please welcome our noble neighbours, the wizards from the Tower of Grommel." All heads turned to the empty third of the amphitheatre, where a large door at the back creaked open. Hunched and bent, a dozen Eldritch shuffled into the hall, down the stairs, and towards their benches. They wore matching black travelling cloaks with large hoods and drooping sleeves, their hands clasped together in a lattice of long fingers and swollen knuckles. Their faces were almost entirely covered by their hoods, only the occasional pointed chin, wriggling beard, and bulbous nose poked from beneath. And the smell. Glip wrinkled his nose. Even now, after having met Eldritch many times before, when they visited his boss, he still couldn't get used to the smell. Something like dead animals and unwashed beggars. It pervaded the hall, and a lattice of murmurs floated about the hall as the delegates covered their mouths and pinched their noses. All stared, fixated by the wizards. One by one, these frail and dirty creatures reached their seats and sat down gingerly. Glip fancied he could hear the cracking of their knees and the creaking of their backs even from his side of the hall. The Eldritch settled to stillness, a dark presence behind the nervous-looking council, and eyes slowly roved back to the speaker. longer needing to shout, the speaker said gently, "The council now recognizes Diana, Queen of the Fae." Diana flickered her wings and continued to hover above her seat. "Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My lords, ladies, wizards and fey creatures, today I would speak to you of the lands beyond the seas."
"Now yes been talking, Queenie,"
Captain Long Johns shouted, slamming his fist on the table before him. Voice almost drowned out by a great roar of approval rose from the freebooters and buccaneers sat beside him. Long Johns shouted, "Let's go a-plundering over the seas." "No!" Diana snapped, her voice cutting through the freebooters' furor. "We shall not go a-plundering, Captain Long Johns." She glared at the pirate. "To do so invites disaster."
"I beg your pardon?"
Long Johns lifted his eye patch so as to focus on Diana with two perfectly good eyes. "What the devil are you talking about, my good lady?" Glib frowned. Long John's accent is suddenly very posh. Long Johns continued, "Why ever should we worry about inviting disaster?"
"'Cause I told her the things I've seen over the waters,"
El Capitano said. Long Johns turned to El Capitano and asked, "What things, old bean?" Almost lost beneath his expansive hat, El Capitano climbed onto his seat. With thumbs hooked into his belt, he addressed Long Johns and the rest of the assembly.
"I've seen swarms of fairies that eats the flesh from a scallywag bones. I've seen warships as big as castles. I've seen dragons that fly through the skies and swims through the seas."
Gasps rose from the assembly, and Glib glanced at the Commonwealth as they whispered to one another.
"I've seen armies of creatures that stands as high as me knees, and others as tall as a mast. Beasts that breathe poison, and spectres that can suck the life from ye as soon as look at ye. I seen—"
"Your point, please, El Capitano," Baron von Fancy had said, still stroking his mustache. He studied the goblin pirate with narrowed eyes, his lips pursed. "His point is," Diana said, "that Tauber is not alone in the world, and we can no longer behave like children squabbling over toys." "What do you mean?" Fancy had asked. "All we do on Tauber is fight amongst ourselves, bickering over land and moonstones."
"And tea cakes," Mama Gimble shouted. "Don't forget the tea cakes."
"We fight to indulge our little peccadillos and to strengthen our own positions," shouted Diana, ignoring Mama Gimble. Her tone softened, and Glib found himself staring at her again as she rose higher into the air and revolved slowly so as to address the entire council. "But in doing so, we weaken ourselves." Glib blinked and glanced sideways at the assembled wizards. Rumors they somehow benefited from Tauber's continual strife never went away, and that they somehow pulled strings behind the scenes to maintain a state of turbulence on the island. But if that were so, how would the Elrich feel about a united Tauber? Diana continued. And what should happen if these threats from across the sea came here to cause trouble? How should we protect ourselves in our weakened state?
And what would you have us do, huh?
Mama Gimble shouted, standing on her chair and pointing at Diana.
Just think of us, laying down our arms so you lot can steal the clothes from our washing lines, Never mind our tea cakes.
We would never. A chorus of jeers from the assembled gnomes silenced Diana, and the hall erupted into shouts and threats. The fawns made obscene gestures at the Dominion and snarled aggressive words in their native tongue. Young Jack stood upon his seat and mooned at Diana. Lady Broadsides and El Capitano unleashed a torrent of invectives upon the Commonwealth that made Glib blush.
"Be quiet!"
Diana shouted. Glib looked at her in astonishment. How could someone so little have such a big voice? Diana continued more quietly. I am talking, and you shall listen. The entire delegation of gnomes jeered and made obscene gestures at Diana, and Mama Gimble looked aghast as she stared at Diana and shouted,
"Don't you talk to me like that, you!"
Hold your tongue and let her finish, Fancy had said, voice low and steady. Its effect, noted Glib, was marked. The Commonwealth delegation, Mama Gimble and all, fell silent immediately. Heads hung in sheepish embarrassment. Fancy had glanced left and right, satisfied his fellow delegates would now behave. He nodded towards Diana and said, "Please, Your Highness, continue." "Thank you, Baron. I think the behavior of you all has made more of an argument than I ever could. I implore you all to consider something other than your own petty squabbles, and to think of something greater, to think of Tauber." Glib looked about the now silent hall. All stared at Diana. Even the attention of the wizards was firmly on the Queen of the Fae. Glib shuffled uncomfortable in his seat, not wanting the intense gaze of the Elrich to ever settle on him. Finally, Fancy had stood, adjusted his head, and smoothed the tips of his mustache. "Your Highness, you make a convincing argument. As much as the weight of history has made peace with the Dominion unpalatable, I concede we are weakened whilst we continue to bicker in the way we have today." He removed his hat, held it to his chest, and bowed. "Therefore, I present myself as a servant to Your Highness, and I ask you to consider my help in uniting Tauber." The Commonwealth around him didn't react. They were shocked into stillness. "I am grateful to you, Baron. I look forward to our working together." Diana glided across the hall to hover before Fancyhead. The very picture of regal poise, she presented her hand to the Baron, arched so that he may kiss the symbol of her sovereignty, the ring of the Fae. Glib studied the Baron as he, in turn, stared at the fabled ring of the Fae. Only the slightest twitch in Fancy Head's right eyelid hinted that he was fazed by the notion of bowing before this fey queen. And yet the Baron took Diana's hand and bent forward, in preparation of kissing the ring and sealing their alliance. Running footsteps rung on the polished stone. "Excuse me, Baron, I have an urgent message for you." Sergeant Tackle? Glib frowned. What's he doing? Why is he even talking to the Baron? Never mind, now. Puzzled, but still bent forward, the Baron looked over his shoulder at the sergeant and said, "Can it wait?" "I fear it cannot, sir." He waved a note to emphasize the point. Glib leaned forward and peered at Tackle. There's something about his eyes. They're wide and glazed. He's still got the same gormless expression he had when Phlegm gave him that piece of... Glib's jaw dropped. The paper. That same small piece of green and tatty paper. That's what Tackle was holding. Only now he was offering it to Fancy Head. Tackle waved the paper and said urgently, "It was sent by a special delivery." Glib looked at Phlegm and watched a small smile creep across the goblin's face. He winked at Glib. "What nonsense," Fancy Head said as he stood and turned away from Diana. "This had better be important, Tackle, or I'll have you flogged." He snatched the paper from the sergeant-at-arms and studied it. Fancy Head's eyes scanned the paper, apparently reading a message, although Glib knew the page was blank. Fancy Head narrowed his eyes and said furiously, "There will be no peace on Tauber." He screwed up the paper and threw it on the floor. Diana looked confused. "Baron?" Fancy Head spun back to Diana, his pupils unnaturally large. His voice was tinged with the same flatness as Tackle's as he said, "We, in the Commonwealth, will take away your moonstones, your homes, and your clothes. We will take everything from you, and we will leave you naked and cold in the rain. And only when you bow before us will we return them to you. Do you understand?" Utter silence. Commonwealth and Dominion alike gawped in disbelief. This was not the expected peace of Machburg. Fancy Head continued, "Now leave. I give you and your delegation an hour to get out of Machburg before I have you all pelted with eggs." Diana scowled and her wings vibrated in agitation. "Let this be a lesson to you all, one that I should have learned long ago. Never trust a foppish human. I am done with your kind, Fancy Head. I shall not offer peace again." If he heard her, he didn't heed her. Instead, the Baron simply walked out of the hall. A cracking of knees and a creaking of backs filled the hall, and all turned to watch the delegates from the Tower of Grommel stand. They turned and began to clamber towards the door. The noise in the hall rose as Commonwealth and Dominion began to argue once more. The speaker returned to his seat, knowing that there was no point in calling for silence.
"Our work here is done," Phlegm said,
shaking with effort as he rose from his seat. The arthritic knuckles on his aged hands turned white as he gripped his walking stick. He stopped and stared across at the retreating Elrich. Glib turned to see one of the bent figures had paused, its gaze await across the distance. It nodded, and Fliggim nodded in reply. The Elrich then turned and joined its fellows. Glib gawked at the goblin. Fliggim gave him a crooked tooth grin and winked.
Now, do you understand why you were assigned to help me get here, young man?
Glib nodded, and mouth dry cleared his throat before saying, "The groat has just dropped, sir."
I doubt that.
Fliggim leaned forward to whisper in Glib's ear.
I only deal in notes.
Well, hunters, sunset is nearing and it's time to head out and see if you can find a moonstone bloom. Links to the Moonstone website are in the notes, along with links to our social accounts. We'd love to see you among our amazing community. For now, happy hunting, and we hope to see you next time.